Hello everyone, welcome back to the Zach GP channel, and in today's episode I have a post-sprint quali final thoughts for F1 Fantasy for the sprint race. Now if you haven't seen one of these videos before, basically what I'll be doing is normally it's after post FP2, however this time round after the sprint quali, I will head over all of the new stats that we have, all of the newest data that we have to build up the best possible teams for everyone out there. And hey, we'll even have a look at those chips. Then to my left, you can also see the A tier and B tier driver and constructors points needed to go up or down in budget. Take Russell, for instance, he needs 18 points to go up 0.3. So keep an eye on these points that are needed because they will come in handy on who you want to bring in, as we do want to look at points. However, budget is important as well. Now, I will tell you everyone, this will be a much more relaxed version of this video because it is 11 o'clock right now and I have work starting at 6 o'clock in the morning. So it's going to be a very, very fast edited video. However, we're still going to go through it all. And as per usual, let's go through my do's and don'ts for the COTA Grand Prix ahead of the deadline. And remember, if I don't mention anyone on this list, do not bring them into your team. Now, starting off with the A tier drivers, I think the first one that has to be very much considered on everyone's team is Max Verstappen. He has shown again that he has the pace to fight the McLarens. He's got the sprint pole, and by quite some margin considering how close it's been in F1 this season so far. Verstappen's looked good for the last few races. I would say he's no longer even a differential 2x option, but if you're just going for the normal 2x or the leading of the A tier drivers, Verstappen looks like the driver that you need to have. Then the next driver you should be looking at would be Oscar Piastri. Again, Oscar Piastri looks good. He's in the top 3. Doesn't look anything too crazy. However, he looks good for points. It really does look like McLaren and Verstappen levels above everyone else. So I still think he's going to be a very popular choice. A lot cheaper than Verstappen and Norris. However, I don't think this time round he gets the 2x, at least in a lot of the team. As a differential choice now, because he is still a useful option, would be Lando Norris. The reason I say differential is because he costs a lot. Realistically, it would be Norris and Piastri together. It wouldn't be Verstappen and Norris unless you can do that. So that's why I say it's a differential. It doesn't really work with having Norris in your team, and with how good Verstappen's looked, I just don't think we can look away from him. And then the final A tier driver you can look at, of course, is George Russell for that consistent good points. Now, he's qualified 5th, actually behind Nico Hülkenberg. However, George Russell in that Mercedes, he'll probably get 4th in the sprint race. He looks like an overall decent asset. He looks good on the budget increases as well. And I still think 4th is good enough to be going over to some of the stuff I'll be talking about later on the chips. So George Russell's still very much a viable asset as well. Then heading into the A tier constructors, and easily the only slap bang constructor you should be looking at bringing in is definitely McLaren. Second and third, the only big team to get both of their drivers into the top 5. So McLaren without a doubt need to be in every single person's team. And then you have a few differentials. So of course, I would say if you're going the extra DRS route, which I'll talk a little bit about more in the team selections, I'd recommend sticking with Mercedes. If you want to go for the differential version, then I'd go Red Bull, trying to hope that Verstappen wins the race. However, it looks like Ferrari is a no-go this weekend. They just don't look like they have the pace. Then heading into the B tier drivers, and it's a little bit different how the B tier driver works, because you can go up 0.6 million in budget and you can also go down 0.6 million. So we have the likes of budgeting options that are great for the budget, such as the likes of Sainz, Lawson, Alonso, Gasly, Colapinto for holding assets. I would go as far as Behrman, as he's proper on thin ice, needing 8 points to go 0.2 million. However, in their own separate bracket, which is just the budgets, you also have the points option as B tier drivers. So if you don't have a lot of money or you need some differential picks to go and try to get some points to get as high up in the rankings as possible, then the top one, who is very much a differential option as he will be going down in value unless he gets 26 points, would be Nico Hülkenberg. He's qualified 4th, is an absolute wonderful qualifying he had. Definitely a differential. It's a sad sight that most of us can't use him because he is just a little bit too expensive and he will go down in budget. But if you need a differential to go all out, he's definitely the option. However, then the actual useful points options that are still working for the budgeting side would be Sainz and Alonso as the big two I expect to see in everyone's team. And then you also have another differential option of Alex Albon. Again, looks good for points, however, looks dreadful on the budget. Then heading over to the B tier constructors, and realistically, one name stands above them all, and it is Williams. Williams were one of the only 3 teams in F1 this weekend so far in Sprint Quali to get both their drivers into the top 10. I really do think they could be used as a differential if you want to go for 3 A-tier drivers, but also they look good for that 0.6 million increase. Sainz and Albon have been looking absolutely spectacular. So I think we will be seeing teams with Williams as a constructor, and they look mighty fine right now. However, the rest of the B tier constructors, I don't really see any fit elsewhere. Williams look like the one to go for. Now, quickly, before we head into the team selections, I do need to mention the chips a little bit. And the reason I need to mention them a little bit is because they will play into the team selections quite a bit for this post-sprint quali prediction. Of course, it is a sprint race weekend. Deadline for the sprint. We've seen what the sprint quali shows us. Extra DRS is definitely a viable option. Now, I would say 100% use extra DRS if you can afford to bring in Verstappen and Piastri, or Verstappen and Russell. However, if you're struggling to get to that and you're looking at Piastri and Russell, I'm thinking potentially you would actually wait until a Qatar, because you're really pushing it on 3rd and 5th being the options from 1st and 3rd. So those are my top drivers for extra DRS if you want to use it this weekend. I'll show my team selections that you can use them in. And then also Limitless wise, I still think it's a great option here. Get it done because it's got diminishing returns. Like I mentioned, the higher the budget everyone has, the lower Limitless can give you over those teams. However, my Limitless team looks like McLaren, Red Bull, Lando Norris, Max Verstappen, Oscar Piastri, George Russell, and Lewis Hamilton. And now, from what we've seen so far, I don't think we should be using any other chip. Potentially wildcarding into a 4A build if that's the way you want to go. But chips like No Negative, Autopilot, I think there'll be better options elsewhere. Let's say you've already used extra DRS, then probably Autopilot would be a good use. However, they're 2nd, 3rd fiddle to the likes of extra DRS and Limitless right now. But with that all said and done, let's now head over to your team selections ahead of the deadline. Now it is that time of the video. I show you, from what we've seen in Sprint Quali results, the best team selections you can go out of your way to make in F1 Fantasy for this weekend. And well, starting off strong, I'm going to be going from the highest budgets down to the lowest budgets possible. So I will be doing every single budget. However, we will start with the high ones. Realistically, this team will set you back around 135 million, with Oscar Piastri as the 2nd A-tier driver, which is crazy to think I'm saying that now, with Max Verstappen as the 2 times. Bear in mind, if you're using extra DRS, it'd just be Verstappen 3 times, Piastri 2 times, which is most likely what I'm going to do. With Carlos Sainz and Fernando Alonso, the main 2 I expect to see in everyone's teams when building some budget and for points. They both looked good in Sprint Quali, and they need some easy budget gains this weekend. I know Fernando Alonso's DNF results here aren't spectacular, but I think it's a risk I'm definitely willing to put out there. And then you also have Pierre Gasly just to be a holding asset at 4.5 million with McLaren and Mercedes. Now, Mercedes don't look too incredible. However, I'm hoping Antonelli picks it up a little bit. But this team is a very good team. If you can use this team, I very much expect it to be an extra DRS used as well. And then if you can't afford Fernando Alonso in this team, all you would have to do is drop Fernando Alonso down to Franco Colapinto. Double Alpine, it's not ideal, but it works with the extra DRS usage. Now dropping down to the second teams that you can be using depending on your budget. This will be the low end of the 130 millions, but basically it's just replacing Piastri with George Russell. Again, I still think this is usable as an extra DRS option. Verstappen 3 times, George Russell 2 times, but it follows the same principles with McLaren and Mercedes as your constructors, with Carlos and Alonso and Gasly again. Again, if you can't afford Fernando Alonso, just drop him down to Colapinto. You can do the same thing over with Carlos Sainz instead as well if you want to keep Fernando Alonso, but it's just that simple. If you want the differential team this weekend, if you still want to use extra DRS but you don't have enough budget to have Mercedes in there as well, then that's when you bring in Williams and you can have Verstappen and Piastri there as well. This team will set you back around 126 million, so it's a lot more viable, and it does, like I mentioned, make use of being able to use extra DRS. So it's definitely out there for anyone who wants to use it. However, it definitely is the differential option as Williams, bear in mind it is still just sprint quali, and we've seen how drastically it can change. It's a risk going with them. However, it's a risk with extra DRS that might be worth taking. Then taking a slight drop down from those big 4A teams that I've been talking about, these are the first teams that I wouldn't recommend using extra DRS on. So just keep that in mind because you only have Verstappen as your big 2x option. But as you can see, it looks like Verstappen is the better option as the 2x right now this weekend. Now you'd also have Alex Albon purely for the points, then Carlos Sainz, Fernando Alonso, again great budget and points option, and then Liam Lawson, another good budgeting option. Then funnily enough, on the constructors, you can then use McLaren and Red Bull. Now these teams will cost you around 125 to 126-ish million. So with Red Bull, it is a bit of a differential pick. You're hoping that Verstappen goes and wins it, but if he does, they'll bring in enough points. However, if you can't afford this, all you have to do is drop Red Bull down to Mercedes, and it frees up even more space in your team that you need for that cost cap. And then again, you follow the same principles as we have done before. If you can't afford to have Alex Albon, maybe look over to a Nico Hülkenberg. Again, it's a differential pick, but if you're around these budgeting options, you've kind of got to go for these bold moves now, because big teams with those 4A lineups will be able to score out and out more points each weekend, unless you get big results from a driver that no one else will have. Then Hülkenberg down to Hadjar, Hadjar down to Bortoleto, and then Bortoleto down to Gasly. And then these teams are around the low 110-ishes. So this really does accommodate everyone out there if you need these sorts of teams. Again, if you need a little bit more space to even work on this, then that's where you'll drop down back to Oscar Piastri as that 2x option. And then finally, if you still need even more money on top of that, if you're just starting out an F1 Fantasy and you've got around 100-ish million in the cost cap, then that's when you would drop Mercedes down to a Williams, as Williams do look good as a differential, but right now I still have more faith in Mercedes and Antonelli being able to claw it back. But those are all of the team selections that you should be looking for this weekend. No Ferrari, it doesn't look good for them. Extra DRS, like I mentioned, if you can afford to bring in Piastri Verstappen or Verstappen Russell. But thank you all so much for watching this video. I know the editing was slightly different to how I normally do it and not as precise with some of the budgeting, as I just don't have enough time before I have to go to sleep, so very sorry about that. As per usual, however, I will be live over on FanApp an hour before the deadline, which would be an hour before the sprint race. I will also be in the comments down below for any questions that you have. F1 Fantasy related, F1 related, whatever you want to put down there, comment down below and I will get back to you all. Maybe in about 6 or 7 hours, because by the time I get this out, it will be about 12:30, 1 o'clock, and I'll be straight to sleep for about 3.5 hours of sleep. However, thank you all so much for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and I hope it all helped you out with your F1 Fantasy teams ahead of that deadline. See you all very soon. Take care.